Like when you went and invested $50,000 without telling me?
Oh, damn.
I did inform her.
Jenny is sitting across from Sumit with 3 financial statements spread across the table. And for once she is not yelling, not crying, and not arguing about his family, because she has reached the kind of anger where somebody becomes almost frighteningly calm. She keeps moving her finger from one transaction to another while Sumit tries to explain what she is looking at. But Jenny keeps returning to the same number because there is only one thing she wants to understand. How can almost $96,000 that she believed was protecting their future suddenly be scattered across accounts, commitments, transfers, and financial arrangements she says she never approved? Sumit tells her that saying the money disappeared is completely unfair because much of it still exists in different forms. But Jenny doesn't care about terminology anymore, because from her perspective, money she believed she could depend on has been moved without her fully understanding where it went, who authorized it, or why people in Sumit's family apparently knew more about the situation than she did. And before Sumit can even finish his explanation, Jenny drops another problem directly in front of him, because she has started matching dates on the statements with conversations they had months earlier, and one transaction appears to have happened before a conversation where Sumit reassured her that their financial future was secure. Jenny asks him whether he remembers telling her not to worry, and Sumit says he does, but he immediately argues that telling her not to worry was not the same as telling her that no money had been moved. Jenny looks at him like that answer makes things even worse, because now Sumit isn't denying the conversation. He is arguing over what his reassurance technically meant, and the more carefully he explains himself, the more Jenny starts wondering whether she has misunderstood their finances for much longer than she realized. What makes this so explosive is that Jenny never viewed this money like extra spending cash. This was not supposed to be money for a luxury purchase, a vacation, or something they could casually gamble on because an interesting opportunity appeared. In Jenny's mind, the money represented protection against everything she already worried about as she got older: housing, healthcare, emergencies, travel, unexpected family problems, and the basic fear of waking up years from now and realizing she had built her entire life around Sumit without having enough financial stability to protect herself. Sumit knew those fears because Jenny had talked about them repeatedly, and that is why she says she trusted him when he told her they were finally building something stable instead of surviving one crisis after another. To understand how Jenny gets from trusting Sumit completely to sitting across from him with paperwork that could potentially destroy their marriage, you have to go back to a much quieter period when nothing seemed obviously wrong. Jenny and Sumit had been talking more seriously about the future, and those conversations were not dramatic because they were finally discussing ordinary married couple concerns instead of fighting about whether they should even be together. They talked about where they would live permanently, how much money they needed available, how they would handle future medical costs, whether they should invest in something that could produce additional income, and whether Jenny needed to keep a separate emergency cushion as she became more dependent on the life they had created together in India. Jenny was actually relieved by those conversations because she felt as though they had finally crossed into a more mature phase of their relationship. After years of conflict, criticism, family opposition, and uncertainty, discussing boring financial planning probably felt like progress. She did not want another shocking secret. She did not want another dramatic announcement. And she definitely did not want to discover that another important part of their life had been decided without her. She wanted predictability, and according to Jenny's understanding, that was exactly what Sumit was promising when he told her that the money they had accumulated and protected would give them options later. Over time, roughly $96,000 became the number Jenny associated with that sense of security. It may not have been sitting untouched in one envelope or one account every day, but Jenny believed the value was protected and that any major movement would be discussed between them first. She understood that normal expenses would happen and that money might be shifted for practical reasons, but she believed there was a line between managing money and changing the structure of their financial future, and in her mind, Sumit knew exactly where that line was. Then one ordinary piece of paperwork changes the entire atmosphere. Jenny is reviewing documents and notices a transfer larger than she remembers discussing, and at first she assumes there is a simple explanation because she has no reason to think otherwise. She keeps reading and sees another transfer, then a different transaction connected to an account she does not immediately recognize, and suddenly she is no longer casually reviewing numbers because the pattern starts looking unfamiliar. The account she thought represented their safety does not show what she expected, and the more she tries to make the numbers fit the story she had in her head, the less sense everything makes. Jenny does not immediately accuse Sumit of stealing anything because even she realizes there could be a logical explanation, so she asks a simple question about whether he recently moved money. Sumit hesitates just enough for her notice, and then he explains that yes, some funds had been moved because several financial decisions had to happen at the right time. Jenny asks why she was not told, and Sumit immediately says she was told because they had already discussed investments, future planning, family responsibilities, and ways to make their money work more effectively. That answer is where the argument really begins, because Jenny says there is a massive difference between discussing possible investments and giving somebody permission to move significant amounts of money. She asks Sumit whether she approved those exact transfers before they happened, and instead of giving her a direct yes or no, he starts describing what they had previously discussed. Jenny keeps bringing him back to the same point because she can already feel him broadening the conversation, and she knows that if she lets him turn this into a debate about their general financial plans, she may never get the answer she actually needs. Sumit becomes defensive because from his perspective Jenny is taking actions that were meant to strengthen their future and describing them as though he secretly emptied everything. He says the money is not gone, and he repeatedly emphasizes that point because he believes Jenny is creating panic around a number without understanding how the funds were reorganized. Jenny tells him that if she cannot see where a large portion of the money is, if she did not approve the movement herself, and if Sumit cannot explain it in a way she immediately understands, then saying it is not gone is not nearly as reassuring as he thinks. That is when Sumit introduces the idea that some funds were used in connection with investments, and for a moment Jenny actually seems prepared to listen because investments at least fit the future planning conversations she remembers. She asks what was purchased, whose name the investment is in, what return they expect, how long the money is committed, and when she agreed to it. Sumit can answer some of those questions, but not all of them in the way Jenny expects, and every missing detail becomes another reason for her to slow the conversation down. Then Sumit mentions family responsibilities, and Jenny's entire posture changes because investments and family responsibilities are not the same category in her mind. She asks whether any of the money went to members of his family, and Sumit initially tries to explain that financial decisions in his family are interconnected and cannot always be separated as neatly as Jenny wants. Jenny immediately rejects that explanation because if money she believed was protecting her retirement was used to solve somebody else's financial problem, she wants to know exactly how much went out, why it went out, and whether there was any realistic plan for it to come back. Sumit says nobody simply took Jenny's money, but that phrasing creates another argument because Jenny tells him to stop talking as though she is accusing everyone of theft. She says she is asking for clarity, and if the explanation is legitimate, then there should be nothing offensive about showing her the details. Sumit replies that the way Jenny is asking makes him feel like she has already decided he betrayed her, and Jenny tells him that discovering financial transactions after the fact does not exactly create the atmosphere for blind trust. What happens next makes everything dramatically worse because Sumit admits that members of his family knew about some of the financial arrangements. Jenny asks whether they knew before she did, and Sumit again tries to add context, saying certain discussions involved obligations and decisions that required information from other family members. Jenny does not need more context to understand the part that hurts her, because she has spent years fighting to prove she belongs in Sumit's life, and now she is discovering that when large financial decisions were being discussed, people who had previously questioned their relationship may have known details about her future before she did. Jenny immediately asks whether Sumit's parents knew, whether other relatives knew, and whether anybody had influence over how the money was being handled. Sumit says she is imagining some secret family conspiracy that never existed, but Jenny tells him that he is missing the emotional point. She does not think every person in his family was sitting around plotting against her, but she cannot understand why anyone outside their marriage needed to understand their financial arrangement before she did. At this point, Jenny wants direct confirmation from someone else, so a family member is contacted to explain part of the arrangement, and for about 30 seconds it looks like Sumit may finally get the support he needs. The relative confirms that money had been moved and that there were legitimate reasons behind at least some of the transactions, But then one small detail immediately causes another problem. Sumit had described a portion of the money as being connected to an investment, while the relative describes that same period as involving a family obligation that needed to be handled quickly. Jenny stops everything because the difference in language matters to her. If money was invested, she wants to know what was purchased and where the value exists. If money was spent on an obligation, she wants to know what was owed and why their shared future had to absorb the cost. Sumit says the two explanations are connected because the financial arrangement involved more than one step, but Jenny points out that nobody seems capable of giving her the same simple story twice. This is the moment where the whole situation changes from an emotional fight into something that starts looking much more serious to everyone around them. Until now, it could still be described as a married couple having completely different communication styles around money, but once Jenny has documents, Sumit is confirming transfers, family members are adding separate explanations, and the dates do not appear to match Jenny's understanding, basic questions become impossible to avoid. Production starts asking those questions, and Sumit immediately becomes uncomfortable because he believes a private disagreement is being turned into something much larger. A producer wants to know where the original funds came from, who controlled the accounts, whose name appeared on different arrangements, which transactions Jenny knew about before they happened, and whether there are documents supporting Sumit's claim that the money remains protected in other forms. None of those questions automatically proves anything terrible happened, but together they expose how little agreement Jenny and Sumit have about the most basic facts. Jenny almost welcomes the questioning because she is exhausted from trying to pull direct answers out of a conversation that keeps expanding every time she asks something specific. Sumit sees the exact same process as an invasion, and he argues that financial arrangements involving relatives, investments, and personal obligations are not things he wants unpacked in front of cameras. That concern would normally be reasonable, but Jenny is now so suspicious that every limit Sumit places on the conversation feels like another locked door. The tension gets worse when Jenny starts matching exact transaction dates to moments in their relationship. She remembers discussing the possibility of moving, and the statement suggests money had already been committed elsewhere. She remembers worrying about healthcare costs, and she believes Sumit reassured her they were financially secure during a period when part of the money had already changed form. She remembers asking whether they had enough available if something happened suddenly, and she says Sumit never told her that access to some of those funds had become more complicated. Sumit says Jenny is taking normal reassurance and turning it into a promise he never actually made. He argues that saying they were financially secure did not mean every dollar remained untouched, because people can still be financially secure while investing money or committing funds towards something valuable. Jenny understands that perfectly well, but she says financial security means nothing if only one partner understands where the security actually exists. Then Jenny asks the question that completely changes Sumit's mood. If all of these decisions improve their position, can he show her exactly what the $96,000 became? That question sounds almost too simple, but it is devastating because it removes every emotional distraction from the conversation. Sumit can explain intentions all day, but Jenny wants a map of the money. She wants to know where every significant amount went, what came back, what is still recoverable, what is tied up, what is gone permanently, and which decisions benefited the two of them directly. If the money became property, she wants documentation. If it became an investment, she wants valuation. If it covered debt or family obligations, she wants to understand why those obligations became part of their financial future. Sumit finally produces paperwork, and this is the first major turning point where it looks like Jenny may have pushed the scandal much further than the documents justify. The paperwork appears to show that a substantial portion of the money did not disappear at all, because it was moved into a legitimate arrangement connected to assets or future value. Sumit becomes noticeably calmer because he finally has something concrete in front of him, and he tells Jenny that this is what he has been trying to explain from the beginning. Jenny reads the paperwork carefully, and her anger begins to soften because she does not want to be right about the worst possibility. If the money still exists, and this has genuinely been a terrible communication failure, she can at least imagine a path forward. Sumit sees that shift and tells her that accusing him before understanding the financial structure was deeply unfair because he has spent years trying to build a life with her and would never intentionally leave her with nothing. For a brief moment, the entire scandal looks like it might collapse under its own exaggeration because Jenny has to acknowledge that at least part of her initial assumption was wrong. She thought a huge amount had simply disappeared, but the documents show that some money remains connected to something with value. That should be good news, and technically it is, but Jenny keeps reading because one detail does not sit right with her. A name on the paperwork is not hers. Jenny asks Sumit why an arrangement involving money she considered part of their future is connected to another person, and Sumit immediately says there is a practical explanation. He starts talking about eligibility, paperwork, how certain transactions are easier to structure through particular family arrangements, and why the decision was supposed to be temporary. Jenny hears all of that, but her mind is stuck on the same issue that keeps returning no matter how much evidence Sumit produces. Why was she not included in the decision before it happened? Sumit says he intended to explain everything after the arrangement was finalized because he did not want Jenny becoming anxious while details were still changing. That is probably the worst possible answer he could give her, because Jenny realizes Sumit may genuinely believe withholding information was an act of protection. He is not describing himself as someone trying to deceive her. He is describing himself as someone who decided that Jenny did not need to understand the process until he felt comfortable presenting the result. Jenny tells him that this is exactly what scares her, because if Sumit believes good intentions justify making financial decisions first and explaining them later, then this is not a one-time misunderstanding. It is a completely different philosophy about marriage. Jenny thinks major decisions require agreement before action, while Sumit appears to believe that if the final outcome benefits them both, temporary secrecy can sometimes be justified. Before they can even resolve that argument, another problem emerges because the documents Sumit produced only explain part of the total amount. The paperwork is enough to prove that Jenny's statement that all $96,000 disappeared would be inaccurate, but it is nowhere near enough to explain every transaction she is questioning. There is still a significant gap, and Jenny now wants a complete accounting rather than another verbal explanation. Sumit says some money went toward family commitments, some remains connected to investments, some covered expenses they had already discussed, and some transactions simply look confusing because money moved through more than one place before reaching its final destination. Jenny tells him that those categories might all be legitimate, but she wants documents matching every one of them. Sumit says gathering everything will take time, and Jenny immediately asks why the person controlling the decisions does not already have the records available. That question hits Sumit hard because he feels as though Jenny has stopped treating him like her husband and started treating him like somebody she is investigating. He tells her that marriage requires trust, and Jenny replies that trust is exactly why she never demanded these documents earlier. She trusted him enough not to ask, and now he is using that previous trust as a reason she should keep trusting him after discovering things she did not understand. Production eventually separates them because the conversation is going in circles, and the individual interviews reveal something important that neither Jenny nor Sumit fully recognized while they were arguing. Their definitions of financial security were never the same. Jenny believed security meant retaining accessible money and making major changes only through joint agreement. Sumit believed security meant using available resources strategically, even if that sometimes required tying money up temporarily or making decisions before every detail could be discussed. Neither definition is automatically ridiculous, but those definitions become explosive when each person assumes the other shares the same understanding. Jenny thought she had veto power over major changes. Sumit thought previous discussions gave him enough flexibility to act. Jenny thought reassurance meant the money remained available. Sumit thought reassurance meant the overall financial plan remained healthy. Then another producer question opens a completely different issue. How much of the original $96,000 came specifically from Jenny's previous savings, income, or resources she brought into the relationship, and how much came from money built jointly afterward? Jenny becomes even more emotional because if a substantial portion came from resources she originally contributed, her sense of exclusion becomes much harder for her to accept. Sumit argues that once money becomes part of their shared marriage, constantly dividing it into what belonged to Jenny and what belonged to him destroys the idea of partnership. Jenny says partnership is exactly why she expected an equal voice over what happened to it. This is where the conflict stops being about a missing number and starts revealing old wounds neither of them completely dealt with. Jenny has spent years feeling as though she repeatedly entered Sumit's world on terms set by other people. She adjusted to his culture, fought for acceptance from his family, dealt with periods when she did not know where their relationship was going, and repeatedly trusted Sumit to handle situations she did not fully understand. Now the financial dispute feels like another version of the same pattern, only this time the consequences could follow her for the rest of her life. Sumit sees the history differently because he believes he has also sacrificed enormously for Jenny. He fought with his family, accepted criticism from people around him, changed expectations about the life he was supposed to have, and remained committed to a relationship that constantly required him to choose between different worlds. From his perspective, being treated like a man who secretly intended to damage Jenny financially feels like an insult to everything he has already done to prove his commitment. That emotional history makes the next confrontation even more painful because neither of them is really arguing about a bank statement anymore. Jenny is saying, "After everything I gave up, why was I still not trusted with the truth?" While Sumit is saying, "After everything I gave up, how can you believe I would betray you?" Those two questions crash into each other because both people believe their sacrifices should have earned trust, but the financial situation has created exactly the opposite. Then the review produces a major twist that changes the entire tone again. After enough documentation is examined, it becomes clear that Jenny's worst fear was not accurate. The full $96,000 did not vanish into nothing, and a significant amount remains tied to assets, arrangements, or recoverable funds. Some transactions that looked suspicious in isolation make more sense once later documents are added, and at least part of the money trail can be followed clearly. Sumit immediately feels vindicated because he has been saying from the beginning that the money was not simply gone. He tells Jenny that she turned a complicated financial situation into a scandal before understanding it, and for a moment Jenny has no choice but to admit that she was wrong about the entire amount disappearing. That admission matters because it prevents the situation from becoming a simple story where one person is completely right and the other is obviously guilty. But before Sumit can treat that as the end of the argument, another conclusion comes out of the review. Jenny may have misunderstood where the money was, but there is still no clear evidence that she knowingly approved every major decision before it happened. That distinction changes everything again. Sumit may not have destroyed their entire financial future, but Jenny's complaint about being left out is not imaginary. The money can still exist, and the communication can still have been completely unacceptable. The investment can be legitimate, and Jenny can still feel betrayed. Sumit can have intended to help them and still have denied Jenny the opportunity to disagree before the money moved. Jenny tells Sumit that he keeps defending the outcome while she is talking about the process. Sumit keeps saying, "Look, the money is still there," while Jenny keeps saying, "Why did I have to discover where it was?" That difference becomes the heart of the entire conflict because Sumit thinks proof of value should calm her down, but Jenny thinks the proof confirms that major financial decisions happened without her full participation. Production then asks Sumit one question that he struggles to answer in a way that satisfies anyone. If Jenny's understanding of the money was wrong for months, why did he never realize she misunderstood? Sumit says they discussed finances many times, and he believed Jenny understood the broad plan. Jenny immediately asks why she was shocked when she saw the statements if they had supposedly discussed the plan clearly. Sumit says Jenny sometimes forgets details or becomes overwhelmed by financial conversations, and Jenny's expression changes because now she feels as though he is blaming her for not understanding information he never presented clearly. Jenny tells him that if she was confused, that should have been a reason to explain things more carefully, not a reason to make decisions without her. Sumit says he was trying to reduce her stress, and Jenny points out that protecting somebody from stress by withholding important information only works until they discover the information themselves, at which point the stress becomes much worse because it is mixed with betrayal. By now, production is no longer treating this as another ordinary argument because there are too many layers involving money, consent, family participation, conflicting interpretations, and unresolved transactions. Filming becomes increasingly difficult because every normal scene is overshadowed by the financial dispute. Jenny does not want to pretend everything is fine, and Sumit does not want to continue answering the same questions while feeling as though every explanation is being treated like evidence against him. Then comes the development neither of them expected. Filming is paused while the financial situation is reviewed further. Jenny is stunned because she never imagined that looking at a bank statement could threaten their future with the franchise. Sumit becomes furious because he believes the entire situation has been inflated from a private financial misunderstanding into a production crisis. He starts telling Jenny that the way she reacted may have cost both of them an opportunity they spent years building, and that accusation immediately starts another argument. Jenny tells him not to blame her for consequences created by decisions she did not understand. She says production would never have become involved if there had been nothing confusing to discover. Sumit says production became involved because Jenny treated him like he had committed some terrible act before giving him time to explain. Jenny says she did give him time, and every explanation created another missing piece. The possibility of losing the show introduces an entirely new financial pressure because now they are not only fighting about money that was moved, they may also lose future income and opportunities connected to being filmed. Sumit points out that if Jenny is truly worried about financial security, creating a situation that threatens their television income hardly improves anything. Jenny tells him that staying quiet just to preserve television money would be even worse, because then the show itself would become another reason it was expected not to ask questions. This is where the argument becomes brutally personal. Sumit says Jenny is willing to throw away everything they built because she cannot accept that he sometimes has to make complicated decisions. Jenny says he is willing to risk everything they built because he cannot accept that being married means she gets to participate before the decision is made. Sumit reminds Jenny how much he fought to be with her, how much pressure he endured from his family, and how often he chose their relationship when walking away would have been easier. Jenny says she remembers every one of those sacrifices, but sacrificing for someone does not give you ownership over their choices later. Sumit says that is not what he is doing, and Jenny tells him that deciding what she needs to know is absolutely a form of controlling her choices. The situation reaches its next breaking point when Jenny and Sumit are told that production is not prepared to continue normally while the dispute remains unresolved. Whether either of them calls it a suspension, a removal, or simply an indefinite pause no longer matters emotionally, because to Jenny and Sumit it feels as though the door is being closed on their future with TLC. Sumit looks devastated and angry at the same time because the show had documented so much of their relationship, including moments when nobody around them believed they would survive. To have their future participation threatened not by his family, not by their age difference, and not by another cultural conflict, but by money, feels almost impossible to process. Jenny's reaction is different because losing the show scares her, but she is more focused on what the scandal revealed about her marriage. She tells Sumit that if cameras disappeared tomorrow and nobody ever watched them again, the original question would still exist. She would still need to know why decisions involving her financial future happened without her clearly understanding them. That statement quiets Sumit because it removes his easiest argument. He cannot say production caused the problem if Jenny would still be asking the same questions without production. He cannot say viewers created the misunderstanding because the documents existed before anybody else saw them. He cannot even say the entire issue disappeared once part of the money was located because Jenny's trust problem has become separate from the account balance. Later, when the immediate chaos is calmed down, Jenny sits with Sumit and asks him one question she has been avoiding because she knows the answer could hurt more than any financial statement. She asks when he planned to tell her everything if she had never discovered the documents. Sumit says he would have explained it once the arrangements were complete and once he could show her a stable result instead of worrying her with temporary uncertainty. Jenny asks whether that means weeks, months, or longer, and Sumit cannot give her an exact timeline. Jenny asks whether he would have told her if the investment had worked perfectly and the money eventually came back with a profit, or whether he would simply have presented the improved balance and never explained how much risk was taken in between. Sumit says that is unfair because he was not trying to hide some dangerous gamble, but Jenny tells him the exact level of risk is almost secondary now. She is trying to understand whether Sumit believes results matter more than permission. If the outcome had been excellent, would he have considered the secrecy justified? If the outcome had been terrible, would he have admitted she should have known earlier? Jenny wants to know where Sumit personally draws that line. For the first time, Sumit seems less defensive and more conflicted because he realizes Jenny is not asking him to defend one transaction. She is asking him to explain how he thinks a marriage should work. Sumit says there are times when one partner handles things the other partner does not fully understand, and that does not automatically mean disrespect. Jenny agrees, but she says handling something is different from changing something. She is comfortable with Sumit managing details, but not with him making major decisions that alter what resources she can depend on. Jenny tells him she can accept that he understands certain parts of life in India better than she does, and she can accept that some systems are confusing to her. What she cannot accept is having her lack of familiarity used as a reason to reduce her involvement. If she does not understand, explain it. If she disagrees, argue about it. If they cannot agree, delay the decision. Anything is better than discovering afterward that the decision already happened. Sumit tells her he genuinely thought he was protecting her from unnecessary stress, and Jenny responds that she does not need protection from information about her own future. She says being older does not make her incapable of understanding risk, being foreign does not make her incapable of making decisions, and loving Sumit does not mean she surrendered the right to say no. That line changes the emotional weight of the entire story because suddenly the $96,000 becomes a symbol for something Jenny has been fighting for since the beginning of their relationship. She has always wanted to be treated as Sumit's equal partner, not as someone who has to wait for other people to decide what happens next. The financial scandal hits so hard because, in Jenny's mind, it recreates the same insecurity in a completely different form. Sumit insists that he sees her as an equal, but Jenny asks him to prove it by giving her every remaining document. She wants everything on the table, even if the explanation embarrasses him, even if some decisions look worse than he intended, and even if the final accounting proves Jenny herself misunderstood parts of the situation. She tells him she would rather deal with an ugly truth once than spend the next 5 years wondering what else she does not know. Sumit reluctantly agrees, and for a moment, it looks like this could finally become the turning point where the marriage begins recovering. More records are gathered, more transfers are identified, and several amounts that previously seemed impossible to explain start making sense. Some funds were moved twice, creating the appearance of separate losses when they were actually part of one chain. Other amounts were committed temporarily and later returned. A few expenses were things Jenny had vaguely known about but never connected to this specific pool of money. Every clarification reduces the financial mystery, but strangely, it does not reduce Jenny's anger at the same speed because understanding where the money went does not change how she found out. Sumit notices that and becomes frustrated again. He asks what else Jenny wants from him if he can account for the money, and Jenny tells him she wants him to understand that proving he did not steal from her is an extremely low standard for a marriage. Jenny says the real standard is whether they can make major decisions together without one person deciding the other will understand later. Sumit says he understands that now, but Jenny is not sure whether he understands it because he truly agrees or because the consequences became so serious. If production had never paused filming and Jenny had never found the statements, would Sumit still believe he did anything wrong? That question remains unanswered when one final document appears. Compared with everything they have already discussed, the transaction is not enormous, but it immediately stands out because Jenny does not recognize the destination and the date falls outside the timeline Sumit had just finished explaining. She points to it and asks what it is, and Sumit's reaction changes just enough for Jenny to notice. Sumit tells her that transfer is separate from the $96,000 issue and should not be mixed into the same argument. Jenny asks why it is coming from the same general financial picture if it has nothing to do with anything they have been discussing. Sumit says the money was used for something personal and was later supposed to be balanced out, but Jenny wants to know what personal means. Sumit becomes irritated because he feels as though Jenny is now going to question every dollar he ever touched, and Jenny says maybe she would not feel that need if she had not discovered so much after the fact. Sumit tells her that married people still deserve some privacy, and Jenny agrees, but she says privacy and secrecy are not automatically the same thing. Jenny asks whether the transfer went to his family. Sumit says, not exactly. Jenny immediately focuses on those two words because after everything they've been through, not exactly is the kind of answer that guarantees another hour of questions. She asks whether the transfer benefited somebody in his family, whether it was connected to a debt, whether it was a loan, and whether he expected the money to return. Sumit says there is an explanation, but this time Jenny does not let him begin with the explanation. She asks for the document first. That small change tells you exactly how much trust has been lost because earlier Jenny would have listened to Sumit and then looked for proof only if something sounded wrong. Now she wants proof before the story. Sumit sees that change too, and for the first time he seems to understand that even if every transaction eventually has an innocent explanation, their relationship has already paid a price. Jenny tells him the $96,000 was never just a number, because the money represented the one thing she desperately needed after years of uncertainty, the belief that she and Sumit were finally making important decisions as one unit. If the money can be explained but the secrecy cannot, then recovering the balance does not automatically recover the marriage. Sumit asks Jenny whether she truly thinks this could end them after everything they survived together, and Jenny says that may be exactly why it could end them. They survived family rejection, criticism, distance, cultural conflict, and years of people saying their relationship would fail, but those problems mostly came from outside the marriage. This problem came from inside. Jenny says she always believed that as long as she and Sumit were honest with each other, they could fight everybody else together. What she never prepared for was the possibility that she might eventually have to protect herself from decisions Sumit made while believing he was helping her. Sumit looks at the final document and insists there is still more context, but Jenny is no longer interested in context without evidence. She tells him to show her everything, explain every transfer, and let her decide for herself whether the reasons were good enough. Sumit asks whether she will ever trust him again if he does, and Jenny cannot answer immediately, because that is the first question all day that has nothing to do with numbers. Their future with TLC may already be damaged, the public version of their relationship may never look the same again, and the $96,000 controversy may eventually prove far less financially catastrophic than Jenny originally believed. Yet the real damage is now sitting between them in a form neither statement nor investment record can measure, because once one person starts wondering whether important information is being withheld for their own supposed benefit, every future reassurance becomes harder to accept. If Sumit eventually proves that nearly every dollar can be accounted for, then Jenny still has to decide whether financial transparency after being caught is enough to rebuild trust. If he cannot account for that final transaction, then the scandal becomes something much more serious, because it means the explanation they thought was finally complete still has another hole inside it. And the most uncomfortable part is that neither outcome automatically saves their marriage. If the remaining money is explained, Sumit can say he never intended to harm Jenny, but Jenny can still say intention does not replace consent. If the remaining money cannot be explained, then every reassurance Sumit gave her becomes even harder to believe. Either way, Jenny is now facing a question much bigger than where $96,000 went. She has to decide whether the man she fought nearly everyone to be with still sees her as a partner who deserves the full truth before decisions are made, or as someone who should simply trust that he knows what is best and wait for the explanation afterward. And when Jenny looks at Sumit one final time, she does not ask him whether the money is safe anymore, because that question has already been answered as much as it can be answered. Instead, she asks the one question Sumit cannot solve with another document, another investment record, or another explanation about his intentions. If protecting their future required keeping Jenny in the dark, then whose future was he really protecting? This entire script is a fictional dramatization created solely for entertainment and does not claim that Sumit, Jenny, TLC, or any related person actually participated in the events described.